Today we will discuss the study tips for AZ-305 Designing Microsoft Azure Infrastructure Solutions exam and share online practice exam to test. We collect 4 study tips for your preparation. 1. Create a study plan. 2. Understand AZ-305 exam topics. 3. Hands-on practice. 4. Take a practice exam. Before taking your exam, you should understand the AZ-305 exam overview. You should master the 4 topics for Microsoft AZ-305 exam. Practice online AZ-305 free questions from Cert 007. Question 1. You migrate App 1 to Azure. You need to ensure that the data storage for App 1 meets the security and compliance requirement. What should you do? A. Create an access policy for the blob. B. Modify the access level of the blob service. C. Implement Azure Resource Locks. D. Create Azure RBAC assignments. Answer. A. Question 2. You need to recommend a strategy for migrating the database content of Web App 1 to Azure. What should you include in the recommendation? A. Use Azure Site Recovery to replicate the SQL servers to Azure. B. Use SQL Server Transactional Replication. C. Copy the BACPAC file that contains the Azure SQL database file to Azure Blob Storage. D. Copy the VHD that contains the Azure SQL database files to Azure Blob Storage. Answer. D. Question 3. You need to recommend a strategy for the web tier of Web App 1. The solution must minimize. What should you recommend? A. Create a runbook that resizes virtual machines automatically to a smaller size outside of business hours. B. Configure the scale-up settings for a web app. C. Deploy a virtual machine scale set that scales out on a 75% CPU threshold. D. Configure the scale-out settings for a web app. Answer. A. Question 4. You need to recommend a solution to meet the database retention requirement. What should you recommend? A. Configure a long-term retention policy for the database. B. Configure Azure Site Recovery. C. Configure geo-replication of the database. D. Use automatic Azure SQL database backups. Answer. A. Question 5. You need to recommend a solution to generate a monthly report of all the new Azure Resource Manager resource deployment in your subscription. What should you include in the recommendation? A. Azure Analysis Services. B. Application Insights. C. Azure Monitor Action Groups. D. Azure Log Analytics. Answer. D. Question 6. You plan to automate the deployment of resources to Azure subscriptions. What is the difference between using Azure Blueprints and Azure Resource Manager, ARM, templates? A. ARM templates remain connected to the deployed resources. B. Only ARM templates can contain policy definitions. C. Blueprints remain connected to the deployed resources. D. Only blueprints can contain policy definitions. Answer: C. Question 7. Your company develops Azure applications. You need to recommend a solution for the deployment of Azure subscriptions. The solution must meet the following requirements. What should you include in the recommendation? A. Provision resource groups. B. Support deployments across all Azure regions. C. Create custom role-based access control, RBAC, roles. D. Provide consistent virtual machine and virtual network configurations. Answer: D. Question 8. You have an Azure subscription that contains an Azure SQL database. You are evaluating whether to use Azure reservations on the Azure SQL database. Which tool should you use to estimate the potential savings? A. The Purchase Reservations blade in the Azure portal. B. The Advisor blade in the Azure portal. C. The SQL database blade in the Azure portal. Answer: A. Question 9. You have 100 devices that write performance data to Azure Blob Storage. You plan to store and analyze the performance data in an Azure SQL database. You need to recommend a solution to continually copy the performance data to the Azure SQL database. What should you include in the recommendation? A. Azure Database Migration Service. B. Azure Data Box. C. Data Migration Assistant, DMA. D. Azure Data Factory. Answer: D. Question 10. You have an on-premises storage solution. You need to migrate the solution to Azure. The solution must support Hadoop Distributed File System, HDFS. What should you use? A. Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2. B. Azure NetApp Files. C. Azure Data Share. D. Azure Table Storage. Answer: A. Why choose CERT 007 study material for your preparation? Thank you for watching. Subscribe CERT 007 for more exam tips and tutorials.